we want to distinguish between the itemized deductions that would happen on a 1040 form versus the business deductions that would happen on Schedule C. Itemized deductions occur on the 1040 when you list out expenses that you've paid that the government has decided you're allowed to take off of your federal income taxes. The most common ones are things like mortgage interest you paid on your primary home, state and local taxes, or any charitable contributions that you make. You can add those up, and theoretically, you can use that number to offset some of the income that you made from your wages. Congress increased the standard deduction and put a cap on some of the things that you can claim as itemized deductions. So for many artists, the standard deduction will both be easier and a better deal. All of that is different than the kind of deductions that you would take as business expenses on your Schedule C. These are going to be related specifically to your small business income and the expenses that you paid while trying to further your art career. If you are filling out Schedule C and applying it to your 1040, you can take these deductions even if you are not itemizing on the 1040. With all business deductions, documentation is really important. What counts as a business expense? Something that is a regular or ordinary expense for your kind of business. A couple of general concepts related to business deductions for artists. All the income that you make counts as income, and you have to report it. Conversely, you only get a deduction if there's a code that says that it's allowed. Big ones include things like paying for studio rent or a home office, or what's called the cost of goods sold, the materials you had to pay for to make that sculpture. The somewhat vague definition of what counts as a legitimate deduction is that it should be a regular and ordinary expense for your line of work. The government acknowledges that the kinds of expenses that would make sense for your business as a fiber artist are going to be different than my expenses as a painter. One workshop I attended explained that we as artists shouldn't worry about taking a legitimate expense because you are the expert in what it takes to make your art. If you're renting a separate studio as part of your business as an artist, that rent is probably deductible. Having a home studio, or what is known as a home office expense, is more complicated. You need to make sure that it is a dedicated space that is solely used for the purpose of advancing your art career. If you have a room that is a studio, you can probably count it. But just because you sent emails asking for a show while you were sitting on the couch in your living room doesn't mean that you get to deduct your living room. When defining what is a dedicated space for making art, ideally, you'd have a separate room with a door, so it's clear exactly where your studio starts and stops. Then, you calculate the square footage of your studio and figure out what percentage of your entire home or apartment that square footage is. So if you have a 100 square foot studio in a 1,000 square foot apartment, your home office is 10% of your home. If you don't have a separate door and you don't have a separate room, you still will need to make sure that it is a dedicated space that is used exclusively for the purpose of your art. I have actually known people who put tape on the floor so they would know where their studio ended and their kitchen began. If you have a qualifying home office, you can use that same percentage of your entire home to deduct things like rent or mortgage interest or real estate taxes, your utilities for the entire house, homeowners or renters insurance, and sometimes structural improvements that you make to the home, as long as they include the studio. Do note that you're only taking a percentage. So if, for instance, your electric bill is huge because you keep running kilns, you'll still only be able to take the percentage equal to the square footage of your studio compared to the square footage of your entire home. Business deductions for artists include the things you spend money on to make yourself a better artist. Documentation is really important. So save all the receipts for things like material, the paper, the wood, the clay, the paint, the fabric, the whatever it is you're using. Equipment is slightly different. Definitely save the receipts, but in some cases, for large, durable goods, things that last longer than a year, instead of deducting all of the cost immediately, you may have to depreciate the value of that equipment over several years. If you are buying kilns, for example, you probably want to talk to a tax advisor. You also have to be able to distinguish between business expenses and personal expenses. So even though, yes, you use your computer to help you as an artist, you probably can't deduct the full cost of your computer because you use it for personal things as well. Yet another way Netflix is trying to mess you up as an artist. You could, in theory, keep a log of every second of your phone usage to distinguish between the business and the personal aspects of it. But even if you had the capacity to keep that record, I'm not sure anybody would buy your documentation. So unless you have a separate phone line that's just for business, you're probably not going to deduct it. Though that does raise the question of whether or not you want to have some separate accounts for your business. A credit card that you use exclusively for art could make it easier for you to track all of your expenses. With forms of travel, they may be deductible if they're directly related to your career as an artist. If the only reason you were going to Fairbanks, Alaska was to attend the opening reception of your exhibition, then that is a legitimate travel deduction. When I take my kids down to Denver to visit the zoo, that mileage isn't deductible, even if I drop off a piece at my gallery while I'm down there. You can deduct not only air travel, but mileage that you put on your personal vehicle. It needs to be documented in several specific ways that we'll talk about when we're looking at Schedule C in more detail. Instead of deducting the cost of your meals while you're on your art trip, the government will establish what they consider to be a reasonable per diem. It will vary based on where you go. The per diem used to calculate expenses in New York City is going to be a lot higher than the per diem that you get for going to Omaha. Legitimate expenses aren't limited to just the things that you use to make the art, but also things that help you to research or become inspired to make the art. Books on other artists, workshops you've attended, trips to go and see galleries can all be considered legitimate deductions. You've got to have documentation for it and a reasonable justification for how it's helping you as a small business. Which isn't to say that you want to spend money just because you can get a deduction for it. Think back to the tax brackets. Spending $100 on a fancy new thingamajig just because you can take a deduction doesn't make financial sense because you're spending $100 to get maybe $12 back. If you need the thing, buy it and deduct it, but don't buy things just to get the deduction. Ask for help. If your career as an artist is really taking off, it's probably worth it for you to hire a CPA, a certified public accountant, especially one that's familiar with small business deductions. Chances are pretty good it will save you money, even accounting for the fee that you have to pay that professional. Chances are even better that it will save you lots of sleep and anxiety because you don't have to worry about whether or not the IRS is going to come knocking on your door.